My husband was in a car accident and had to be hospitalized. Seeing an elderly woman in the next bed with no one to care for her, I took the opportunity to help by buying her 3 meals a day. The grateful woman insisted on rewarding me, but what she placed in my hand was an old Confederate bill, and with a single sentence, she opened my eyes. Some will sigh, others will be outraged, and some will fall silent for a moment, seeing a reflection of their own lives in these words. That afternoon, just after 3, Emily was in her office, a stack of unfiled reports in her hand, when her phone began to ring insistently. It was an unknown number. Emily hesitated for a moment, but a knot of dread tightened in her stomach, and she answered. On the other end of the line, a man's voice spoke quickly and concisely, like someone used to delivering bad news. He introduced himself as emergency staff from Mercy General Hospital and got straight to the point. Are you Emily? Your husband Mark has just been in an accident and is being brought to the ER. Please come as soon as you can. Emily couldn't remember if she said yes or okay. Only the moment she dropped the phone and the reports fell onto the desk with a thud as her mind went blank. That very morning, Mark had put on his shirt, tied his shoes, and told her he would be back soon for dinner. And now, in the blink of an eye, he was in the hospital. In the cab on the way, Emily trembled and prayed. She prayed he hadn't lost a limb, prayed that their home would remain intact. They had been married for 5 years, and although it hadn't all been a walk in the park, Emily believed that, at least for her, the word family still meant something. Upon arriving, she ran breathlessly to the trauma wing. She pushed open the door to the room and saw Mark in the bed by the window, his left leg encased in a thick cast and suspended from a frame. His face was pale. Emily felt a mixture of relief and sorrow and rushed to take his hand. Mark, does it hurt a lot? How did this happen? Mark looked at her, but not with the joy of seeing his wife, but with a scowl. His voice hit her like a bucket of ice water. You're just getting here now? I've been here since noon. Emily froze for a second. She wanted to tell him she had come as soon as she got the call. She wanted to tell him about the traffic, ask what the doctor had said. She wanted to hug him and cry, but his attitude tied a knot in her throat. Still, she swallowed and said softly, I came as soon as I could. What did the doctor say about your leg? Mark frowned. A fracture. What else? I'm admitted, that's what. Now go get me something to eat. I'm hungry. Emily bit her lip and nodded. What do you feel like eating? Mark waved his hand dismissively. Whatever. Just hurry up. Emily turned to leave, her heart aching with grief and humiliation. As she passed the adjacent bed, she noticed an elderly woman lying there. Her hair was completely white, her face a roadmap of wrinkles, and one of her legs was also in a cast. She was trying to sit up, propping herself on her elbows, but couldn't manage. She held an empty plastic container, her gaze lost towards the door, a sad look like that of someone forgotten. Emily paused. Ma'am, do you need some help? The old woman turned and gave her a kind smile, her voice hoarse. No, don't worry, dear, I can manage. I was going to get some dinner, but this leg of mine won't cooperate. Emily looked at the cast on her leg and the empty bedside, with no one beside her. And your family? The old woman answered slowly. I have a son who works out of town. I called him. He said he was on his way, but he hasn't arrived yet. I'm here alone. Just those 3 words. Alone. Emily felt a pang in her heart. There are times when people don't need money, just a hot meal and someone to care. Without a second thought, she told her, I'm going to the cafeteria to buy dinner for my husband. I'll get something for you too. What would you like? The old woman's eyes lit up, as if she had just been rescued from a frozen river. Really, dear? Well, some broth and a piece of bread would be nice. Something simple. Emily smiled. Of course, just a moment. In the cafeteria, she bought Mark chicken broth and some steamed vegetables. For the old woman, she bought a light broth and a hard-boiled egg, thinking an older person needed some substance. It all cost just a few dollars, but what Emily placed on that tray was a gesture of sincere compassion. She set Mark's tray on the nightstand. Here you go, eat it while it's hot. Mark barely glanced at her, picked up the spoon, and started eating without a word of thanks. Emily approached the old woman and handed her the broth. Eat up, ma'am, I brought you an egg as well. The old woman took it, her eyes red. "You're so kind, dear, I don't know what to say. Let me pay you." She fumbled in the pocket of her robe, but Emily stopped her. "Don't worry about it, it's nothing. Eat and get your strength back." The old woman shook her head vigorously. "I can't do that. I'm old, and I don't want to owe anyone anything." Emily sighed and said gently, "Well, we'll figure it out later. Eat before it gets cold." The following days, Emily devoted herself to both of them. Early in the morning, she would go to the hospital to buy breakfast for Mark and for the old woman as well. At night, the same. Sometimes, the old woman needed to use the restroom, and Emily would help her. Once, her legs trembled, and she almost fell. Emily, pale, held her tightly. "Ma'am, please, call me. Don't go alone, it's dangerous." The old woman, her voice breaking, told her, "You're better than my own daughter." Meanwhile, Mark grew colder and colder, so cold that when Emily returned from helping the old woman, he would look at her like a stranger. One day, Emily bought him his old favorite dish, but he complained. "Always the same thing. I'm sick of it. Go take care of whoever you want. Just leave me alone." That sentence was like a thin blade slicing through her soul. Emily was not without her own fatigue, but she kept thinking that perhaps he was irritable from the pain. Maybe he was scared. Maybe he was frustrated being stuck in bed. She consoled herself with the word maybe, but you lean on a wall to keep from falling. On the 5th day, the old woman's son arrived. His name was David, a thin man with a face worn from travel. As soon as he saw his mother, he knelt and took her hands. "Mom, I'm so sorry I'm late." The old woman cried, and then called Emily over. "Thanks to this young lady, I've survived these past few days." David turned to Emily, overwhelmed. "Miss, really, I won't forget this. Let me give you some money to cover the meals." Emily waved her hand. "No, please, it's not important," David insisted, but the old woman pulled a carefully folded cloth handkerchief from under her pillow and pressed it into Emily's hand. "Take this, so I can have peace of mind. If you don't accept it, I'll feel bad." Emily felt awkward, but thinking that older people value these gestures, she accepted, intending to return it in some other way later. But when she opened it, her heart sank. Inside the handkerchief, there was no money, not a $5 bill, not a 10, but an old, yellowed Confederate bill with large print. Emily was stunned. All the fatigue, all the humiliation, all the anger at her husband's indifference balled up in her throat. She felt her eyes burn, and a cruel thought crossed her mind. Is this what I get for my kindness? She took the bill and walked over to the old woman's bed. Her voice trembled, but anger sharpened it. "Ma'am, what is the meaning of this? I've taken care of you for days, and you give me this. What do you take me for?" The old woman looked up, her old eyes wide with confusion, like a child unfairly scolded. She reached out her hand, flustered. "Dear, don't be angry. Let me explain." But just then, from the other bed, Mark let out a comment as cold as salt in a wound. "See? That's what you get for sticking your nose where it doesn't belong. You brought this on yourself." Emily spun around to look at her husband. In that instant, it wasn't just the worthless bill that hurt, but the person lying there, the person she called her husband, who could watch her suffer and say something so callous. The old woman sighed deeply. Her voice became slower, but firm, like someone with a lifetime of experience. "Emily, listen to me for a moment. I'm not trying to hurt you. I'm just trying to save you from a very big problem, a problem that might be happening inside your own home." Emily froze, the hand clutching the bill turning to ice. The old woman reached out and gently took her wrist. "Give me your hand. I'm going to read it for a moment, and you'll understand why you met me here today and why you can't keep blindly trusting people." Emily swallowed hard. Amid the smell of disinfectant and the sound of carts in the hallway, she felt a vague fear creep up her spine. And she couldn't imagine that, right after that gesture, her life would take an unexpected turn, dragging with it a marriage she thought she knew, but which was actually on the brink of collapse. Emily stood rooted to the spot in the middle of the room, one hand still clutching the yellowed bill, the other held by the old woman. She felt ashamed for raising her voice and, at the same time, bitter over Mark's words, which still echoed in her ears. She wanted to pull away, to leave so everything would stop hurting, But the old woman's voice was strangely serene, the serenity of someone who has weathered many storms and knows what is truly fearsome. The old woman gently pulled Emily's hand, turned it palm up, and traced its lines with her index finger. Her hand was dry, but warm. The worthless bill had broken her heart, Mark's attitude had shattered her inside, and the loneliness in the old woman's eyes kept her from pushing her away. She stood still, feeling her own ragged breath. The old woman closed her eyes for a long moment, saying nothing. The only sounds in the room were the whirring of the ceiling fan, the rattle of a medicine cart in the hallway, and Mark swiping his finger across his phone screen, as if what was happening to Emily had nothing to do with him. It was precisely that indifference that sent a chill up Emily's spine, from her feet to her neck. The old woman opened her eyes and looked directly at her. Her gaze wasn't meant to frighten, but to show compassion. She said slowly, "Emily, you are not seriously ill. You are just exhausted. But what is truly exhausting you isn't running back and forth buying food. What is consuming you is inside your own home." Emily flinched and blurted out, "What do you mean?" The old woman didn't answer right away. She glanced at Mark, then lowered her voice and pulled Emily a little closer to her bed so only she could hear. "Don't mind what I call this piece of paper. I'm an old countrywoman. I have my ways." End quote. "I didn't give you this to curse you. I wanted you to remember one thing. Some things look like money, but are just paper, and some words sound like love, but are just lies. Do you understand?" Emily swallowed. That sentence seemed to describe Mark perfectly. She turned to look at her husband and saw him engrossed in his phone, his back slightly hunched, his broad shoulders looking tired from someone who had suffered an accident. But why, in that tired appearance, did Emily perceive a coldness radiating from him like a shadow, one that didn't belong to the man she had once fallen in love with? She turned back and whispered, "Ma'am, I was rude, I'm sorry, but what did you mean by saving me from a big problem? I don't understand." The old woman sighed, as if sighing for a lifetime of resigned women. She gently pointed to Emily's chest. "Have you noticed that these past few days, it's been easier for you to care for a stranger than for someone in your own house?" Emily was speechless. It was so true. With the old woman, a hot meal and a kind gesture were enough to soothe her heart. With Mark, even if she did 10 things right, he would always find fault with one. She didn't know what to say, just lowered her head. The old woman continued, her voice even lower. "I'm not asking how you live. I'm asking who you live with. The man lying there, before he broke his leg, had been broken for you on the inside for a long time. You think he's irritable because of the accident, that he's cold for that reason. But try to remember, in recent months, has he looked at you the way he used to? Has he shared a meal with you and asked if you were tired? Has he sat down to listen to your stories from the office?" Each sentence was a stab to Emily's heart. The images flooded back like a movie. Mark coming home late, his phone always in his hand. If she asked, he'd snap. "Don't you have anything better to do?" He'd turn his back to her in bed. Once, Emily cooked the beef stew he used to love. He took 2 bites and left it, saying it was bland, when before he always said it tasted like home. Little details like that, Emily had told herself they were due to stress from work because her husband was tired. Now, listening to the old woman, she suddenly saw that all those small details formed a much larger picture, a picture that terrified her. She said in a hoarse voice, "Ma'am, do you know all this just from holding my hand?" The old woman shook her head. "I looked at your hand to know you're not sick, so you wouldn't blame yourself for everything. What's happening in your house I've seen with my own eyes. I'm old, and sometimes I read people better than I read palms." At this point, the old woman raised her head and called out softly, "Mark!" Mark flinched slightly but only glanced at her as if annoyed. "What do you want, ma'am?" The old woman wasn't harsh. She just asked a very simple question. "Your wife has been taking care of you these past few days. Have you said a single word of comfort to her?" Mark smirked, a bitter smile. "Taking care of her husband is a wife's duty, isn't it?" Emily felt her face burn, whether from humiliation or pain. The old woman nodded as if she expected it. She turned back to Emily and said quietly, but with each word clear, "Did you hear that?" Grateful people have good endings. People who see gratitude as an obligation live with bitterness. Stop blaming yourself for not being good enough. Emily blinked rapidly, trying to hold back tears. She wanted to protest, to say that Mark wasn't a bad person, that he was just in pain. But right at that moment, Mark's phone rang. The screen lit up with a name saved as a single letter. L. Mark jumped, a very real jump like someone caught in the act. He glanced at Emily and quickly silenced the call, shoving the phone under his pillow. "Who was that, honey?" Emily asked, her voice sounding like her own but also strangely distant. Mark scowled. "A colleague, about work." Emily fell silent. The old woman did too. But in that silence, Emily could clearly hear her own heart pounding. Suddenly, she remembered a small incident from a few weeks ago. Mark was showering, his phone fell into the water, and the screen went black. He panicked, more than if he'd lost his wallet. He rushed to a repair shop that same night. When Emily asked what was so important, he snapped, "It's work stuff." What kind of work requires such panic? What kind of work gets hidden under a pillow? The old woman gently tugged on Emily's hand. "Don't ask any more questions. If you ask now, you'll just get another harsh reply. If you want to save your marriage, you have to wake up. And to wake up, you need proof. Do you understand what I'm saying?" Emily felt a chill run down her spine. "Ma'am, you sound like you know he—" Emily couldn't bring herself to say the word infidelity, afraid it would become real. The old woman looked at her, her voice growing more serious. "I don't accuse anyone without proof, but I'll give you some advice. From now on, don't be blind in your own house. You see him as your husband, but you also have to see yourself. You have a right to know the truth. You have a right to protect your life." The word "right" made Emily tremble. Her whole life had been lived under the motto of, "It's better to be quiet to keep the peace." Be quiet to avoid arguments. Be quiet not to upset her mother-in-law. Be quiet so the house would be calm. But the more she stayed quiet, the smaller she felt. Until she found herself facing that yellowed bill and understood that sometimes being quiet is suffocating yourself. She asked, her voice lower, like someone walking through fog, "But what should I do now, ma'am?" The old woman moved closer and said slowly and firmly, "Don't make a scene in the hospital. Keep taking care of him as you have been, but pay attention. If he hides his phone, he'll slip up eventually. If he transfers money, it will leave a trail. If he lies, he'll contradict himself. Remember what I'm telling you. Don't win an argument with words. Win with the truth." Emily listened, confused. She didn't want to become a woman who spies on her husband. The idea of acting behind his back disgusted her. But if she didn't, she would continue to be deceived. And the most terrifying thing wasn't losing her dignity, but losing everything and being labeled hysterical on top of it. Especially when she thought of her mother-in-law. Emily's mother-in-law was named Susan, a woman who had always considered her husband's family the center of the universe. If their marriage ever broke down, Susan would certainly not take her side. As if reading her thoughts, the old woman hit the nail on the head. "Does your mother-in-law like you?" Emily froze. She forced a smile. "Well, it's okay, ma'am. No matter what I do, she always tells me it's not enough." The old woman nodded. "All the more reason to protect yourself. Be kind, but don't be a fool. I'll tell you straight, there are families that, while you're the wife, demand you be submissive. When you're about to leave, they'll demand you leave with nothing." That sentence sent shivers down her spine. She looked at Mark. He was typing a message, the corners of his lips curling into a strange smile, not the smile he gave her. The old woman's words echoed in her ears. Some words sound like love, but are just lies. She turned and took the old woman's hand, this time without anger. "Ma'am, I spoke without thinking earlier. I apologize. And thank you." The old woman smiled kindly, patting the back of Emily's hand. "Don't thank me. Just remember that being good is a blessing. But being good without knowing how to protect yourself is a tragedy. Think of that piece of paper as a reminder to wake up." Emily looked at the yellowed bill in her hand and suddenly felt calmer. It was no longer a humiliation. It was like a slap in the face to wake her up. Just then, David walked in. He saw Emily by his mother's bed, her expression different. He felt embarrassed. "Emily, you were upset earlier and I was worried. My mother is old, she has her country ways. She didn't know how to explain herself well." Emily shook her head. "It's not her fault." I overreacted. David glanced at Mark and then at Emily, as if he wanted to say something but held back. In the end, he just said quietly, "If you need anything, let me know. I owe you one." Emily nodded, but inside she felt an immense bitterness. A stranger spoke to her of gratitude, while her own husband considered it an obligation. That night, Emily stayed at the hospital. Mark fell asleep quickly but kept his phone clutched in his hand, as if guarding it. Emily, lying on the cot, turned her back to him, her eyes wide open, staring at the ceiling. The old woman's words replayed in her head. Win with the truth. She didn't want to believe it, but she didn't dare to remain blind either. She told herself that, starting tomorrow, she would start looking closer, not to destroy her home, but to save the person she was. If Mark still loved her, she would find a way to win him back. If his heart had already changed, she wouldn't let them throw her out on the street with nothing. And in that long, stuffy night, for the first time in many years of marriage, Emily understood a painful truth. You don't always save a marriage by enduring. Sometimes, enduring only gives the other person time to plan their betrayal. That night, Emily barely slept. The folding cot against the wall creaked with every move, while Mark, his back to her, maintained that painfully familiar posture. Before, whenever she coughed or shifted, he would turn to ask if she was okay. Now, a cold void lay between them, though they were barely an arm's length apart. Emily stared at the hospital's dull white ceiling, the old woman's words echoing in her mind. Don't argue with words, win with the truth. She felt as if someone had handed her a small flashlight in the middle of the night. The light wasn't enough to see the whole path, but at least it showed her where she was standing. Early in the morning, Emily got up before anyone else. Mark was still asleep, his phone by the pillow, screen down. As she washed her face in the hallway restroom, she caught her reflection in the mirror and was startled. In just a few days, her eyes had become sunken, her cheekbones sharper. She remembered her mother's words. The saddest thing for a woman is to wither because of someone else. At the time, she had laughed, thinking her mother was being dramatic. Now she realized she wasn't wrong. She bought breakfast as usual, a light broth for Mark, and a broth with an egg for the old woman. When she entered, Mark had just woken up. He glanced at the tray without interest and picked up his phone again. Emily no longer asked how he was feeling as she used to. She simply set the tray down and said a single sentence, "Eat it while it's hot." Her voice was so calm, it surprised even herself. Mark looked up, frowning. "Is something wrong with you today?" Emily shook her head. "No, just tired." Mark let out a small huff and said no more. He went back to his screen. Emily noticed he was typing very quickly, his fingers gliding nimbly, and a fleeting smile touched his lips. That smile was not for the wife in front of him. The old woman looked at Emily with a mix of pity and concern. When Mark turned away, she asked in a low voice, "Did you listen to my advice?" Emily nodded slightly. "Yes, I'm learning to see." The old woman didn't ask for more, just sighed. She ate her broth slowly, spoonful by spoonful, as if chewing on time. It was only when her son David came to visit that she called Emily over. "Emily, dear, go home this afternoon and get some things. Being at the hospital all day is exhausting." Emily understood she was giving her space to think. She agreed, though her heart was in turmoil. Going home meant facing her mother-in-law. Just the thought of it made her chest feel heavy. Around 10 o'clock, Susan, her mother-in-law, appeared. She wore a dark floral blouse, her hair in a high bun. Her voice boomed in the room as soon as she entered. "My goodness, how is it that at this hour you're only giving him broth? What kind of daughter-in-law are you?" Before Emily could answer, Mark intervened. "I've already eaten, Mom. Emily brought it for me." Susan shot Emily a glare, saying nothing more, but that look was enough to make Emily feel insignificant. She sat on the bed, stroking Mark's leg, her tone softening completely. "Son, why didn't you call me sooner? I should have been the one to take care of you. What does a young daughter-in-law like her know?" Emily felt her ears burn, but she remembered the old woman's words and held back. Before, she would have tried to explain, to make excuses. Now, she remained silent. Her silence seemed to annoy Susan even more. She turned to Emily. "And what are you doing just standing there? Don't you see the house is being neglected? With your husband in the hospital, you still have time to worry about strangers." Emily knew she was referring to the old woman. She answered quietly, maintaining her respect. "The lady is in the same room. She has no one to care for her. I'm just helping her a little." Susan let out a bitter laugh. "In this day and age, nobody helps for nothing. Be careful they don't take advantage of you." That sentence stung Emily. Who was taking advantage and who was grateful, she knew better than anyone, but she said nothing, just lowered her head. Susan turned her attention back to Mark, asking him all sorts of questions. Mark answered with little interest, his eyes glued to his phone. Seeing this, Susan got angry. "What are you doing with that phone all day in the hospital? Give it to me. I'll keep it for you." Mark flinched and said hurriedly, "No, Mom. I have some things to sort out." Susan stared at him, then looked at Emily, a look that seemed to ask, "What kind of things does he need to hide?" Emily stood there, her heart pounding. Part of her wanted Susan to discover something, so she wouldn't feel so alone in this, but another part was afraid of everything exploding in a way she couldn't control. Susan stayed until noon and then left, not without giving Emily a long list of instructions. When she was gone, the room fell silent again. The old woman looked at Emily and shook her head. "Your mother-in-law is a difficult one." Emily smiled sadly. "Yes, she's always been like that." The old woman placed a hand on hers. "Remember, when something serious happens, the first person to push you away is usually not a stranger." That sentence sent a chill down her spine. In the afternoon, Emily asked for permission to go home for some things. Mark didn't ask any questions, just nodded. She took a cab to the house where she had lived for 5 years. As she opened the door, the familiar scent washed over her, but it no longer felt warm. The house was tidy, everything was the same, but the feeling was different. She went to the bedroom. The nightstand drawer was empty. The important financial papers, the savings account statements, copies of the house deed, they were gone. Her heart started to pound. She searched everywhere, without success. A growing panic took hold of her. Just as the old woman had said, "Don't be blind in your own house." She sank onto the bed, her hands trembling. If Mark had secretly moved the papers, it meant he had already planned his exit. The thought of it made her throat tighten. In 5 years together, she had never kept anything for herself, fully trusting in the word marriage. She picked up her phone and called Mark. The phone rang and rang until it went to voicemail. She called again. No answer. On the third try, Mark picked up, his voice annoyed. "What is it? I'm busy." Emily took a deep breath. "The papers for the house. Where did you put them?" There was a few seconds of silence on the other end. Then Mark said, "I have them for convenience, don't worry about it." "Convenience for whom?" Emily asked, her voice unable to hide its tremor. Mark snapped, "Why are you asking so many questions? If you trust me, then let me handle it." The phrase "trust me" now sounded like a sick joke. Emily hung up, tears welling in her eyes. Not for the papers, but for the blatant contempt he no longer bothered to hide. She sat there for a long time. Finally, she stood up. She only packed a few changes of clothes and her toiletries. She didn't touch anything she once considered part of her home. Before leaving, she looked at the house one last time, wondering silently, if I hadn't woken up, what would my end have been? When she returned to the hospital, it was already getting dark. The old woman, upon seeing her, immediately asked, "How did it go, dear?" Emily shook her head, her voice a hoarse whisper. "I see it now, ma'am." The old woman didn't ask for more details, just nodded as if she already knew. She had Emily sit down and told her quietly, "Remember, from now on, every step you take, you must think of yourself first. Not out of selfishness, but to save yourself." That night, Mark slept soundly. The phone was on the nightstand, no longer clutched in his hand. Emily, lying on the cot, stared at that phone for a long time. Her heart was beating so hard she could hear it in her ears. She knew that just by reaching out her arm, she could grasp the truth she both feared and needed. She sat up, tiptoeing over. Her hand touched the cold phone. She looked at Mark. He was fast asleep, his mouth slightly open. In that moment, she saw a completely different Mark. He was no longer her husband, but a stranger hiding something. She unlocked the screen. It lit up. And in that instant, she knew that from that second on, her marriage would never be the same, even if she wanted to go back. Emily stood motionless by the nightstand, holding Mark's phone, her heart pounding so fiercely she was afraid it would wake the entire room. The screen's light cast a cold, blue glow on her face. She took a deep breath, telling herself she would just take a quick look, just to know where she stood in this marriage, not to torture herself. But the moment her fingers touched the screen, she knew there are truths that, once seen, can never be unseen. The password wasn't their wedding anniversary, nor was it Emily's birthday. She tried a series of familiar numbers from her memory of Mark, then paused. Suddenly, the letter L she had seen on the screen that morning came to mind. With trembling hands, she entered Mark's birth date, combined with an odd number. The screen unlocked. Emily was petrified. Not because she had guessed correctly, but because she understood that this man no longer used memories of their marriage to protect his private world. The messaging app appeared before her eyes. At the top, a single-character name stood out. L. She tapped on it. Every line of text that appeared was like a slow stab. Sweet messages asking how he was, words of longing, quick selfies in a restroom mirror, promises to meet as soon as the cast came off. Emily read without being able to cry. It felt as if she had run out of tears in advance. One message made her cover her mouth to stifle a sob. "Just hang in there a little longer, babe. She trusts me completely. When this is all over, I'll take care of you. She trusts me completely." Those 4 words struck directly at her pride. It turned out that the trust she had maintained for 5 years was, in Mark's eyes, just an advantage. She kept scrolling. She saw clear and concise money transfers. They weren't huge amounts that would raise suspicion, but they were regular enough to show the relationship was no fling. That money, Emily recognized, came from their joint account. She remembered every time she had hesitated to buy a new blouse, every time she had thought twice about a small indulgence, thinking about saving for an emergency. And all the while, Mark was using it to fund another world, another person. She turned off the screen and placed the phone back where it was. She felt completely drained of strength. She returned to her cot and sat down, hugging her knees. In that moment, she didn't think about what to do next. She thought of only one thing: how stupid she had been to apologize for Mark's coldness, to blame herself for not being good enough to keep her husband. Mark shifted slightly. Emily held her breath, but he just turned over and continued to sleep. In the darkness, she looked at that familiar face and suddenly it seemed like a stranger's. This man, whom she once considered her rock, was now the source of her fear. The next morning, Emily got up very early. This time, it wasn't out of habit to care for anyone, but because she couldn't stand another second in that atmosphere of lies. She went out into the hallway and sat on a cold bench, watching the sunrise. She felt a great emptiness inside, but strangely, she was very clear-headed. The panic from the day before was gone, replaced by a quiet resolve. The old woman, being pushed in a wheelchair by David to get some sun, saw Emily. A single glance was enough for her to understand. "You know now, don't you?" she asked, unsurprised. Emily nodded, a lump in her throat. "Yes, I know." The old woman sighed and took her hand. "Poor child, but it's better to know sooner rather than later." "Have you cried yet?" Emily shook her head. "The tears won't come anymore," the old woman told her. "Don't worry. At times like these, women should save their tears for other things. Now listen to me carefully. Don't make a scene. Don't expose him now. The calmer you are, the more you stand to gain." Emily looked at her, her eyes filled with confusion. "But I can't take it anymore." The old woman nodded. "I know, but hold on a little longer to protect yourself. You still have a house, rights, your honor. Don't let him turn you into a woman who not only loses her husband, but also carries the blame. Even the parted round." Those words were like bricks paving a path for Emily to stand firm. She understood that the old woman spoke not just from experience, but from a lifetime of observing the consequences of badly handled breakups. Susan arrived at the hospital around noon, carrying a pot of soup. Her voice, as always, was shrill. "Mark, I made this for you. Young daughters-in-law know nothing about food that gives you strength." Emily stood up and greeted Susan politely. Susan looked her up and down and huffed. "Are you back from the house already?" "The house can't be left in a mess like this," Emily replied calmly. "Yes, I went to get some things." Susan stared at her. "What things do you need to get so many of? Are you planning on moving out?" The question startled Mark. He turned to Emily, a flash of alarm in his eyes. Emily maintained an even tone. "Just my personal things, Mom. It's uncomfortable being in the hospital without them." Susan laughed scornfully. "Personal things that require a suitcase? You're exaggerating." Emily didn't argue. At that moment, any verbal dispute seemed pointless. She just registered every reaction, every glance. The old woman was right. The first person to push her away wasn't the other woman, but her own family. That afternoon, David got permission to take his mother to rest early. Before leaving, the old woman called Emily over and whispered, "Remember my words. Save everything you've seen. Don't believe in empty promises. When you need me, I'll help you." Emily took her hand, this time tightly. "Thank you, ma'am. Without you, I don't know what I would have done." The old woman smiled kindly. "You helped me with a few meals. I'm giving you back a path. It's the circle of life." At night, the room was left with just Emily and Mark. The atmosphere was so tense you could hear the clock ticking. Mark was the first to speak, his tone softer than usual. "You've been very tired these past few days. Go home and rest. My mom can handle it." Emily looked at him. She felt a chill. It turned out that when he no longer needed to pretend, he started acting considerate. She smiled slightly. "I can stay." Mark frowned. "Why are you pushing yourself? I already told you I'm fine." Emily fell silent. She understood he wanted her away so he could plan freely. The more she thought about it, the more she realized she had to stay clear-headed. That night, Mark received a call. He went into the hallway to talk, lowering his voice, but unable to hide an intimate tone. Emily, lying on the cot, heard his footsteps fade away. Before, she would have gone out to ask. Not anymore. She opened her own phone and started noting down everything she knew, everything she had seen. Not for revenge, but to save herself. When Mark returned, Emily was already on her side, pretending to be asleep. Mark stood looking at her for a moment. Emily felt his gaze, but didn't move. In that instant, she knew there was nothing left to say between them. She closed her eyes, but didn't sleep. In her mind, the images of the old woman, the yellowed bill, the messages, her mother-in-law's cold stares all replayed. Everything fit together into a picture, as clear as it was cruel. But it was that clarity that gave her a new strength. She was no longer the woman who only knew how to endure. She told herself that starting tomorrow, she would begin preparing for a confrontation, not from anger, but from lucidity. Whatever the outcome, she would not be left empty-handed and silent. Outside the window, the sky had grown completely dark. The hospital lights cast a yellowish glow on the courtyard, identical to the color of the bill the old woman had given her. Suddenly, she understood. Some things seem like bad luck, but they are actually a warning at just the right time. The next morning, Emily woke up in a strange state. She no longer felt the panic or rage that had squeezed her chest in the preceding days. In her mind, there was only one clear thought. "I know the truth, and from now on every step must be the right one." She looked at Mark. He was still sleeping, his face peaceful, as if he had never caused a storm. Emily realized that some people betray without needing to seem evil. They just have to be cold enough to turn their backs. She quietly gathered her things and went to wash her face. Looking in the mirror, she no longer saw the frightened woman from the day before, but a woman reminding herself not to be weak. When Mark woke up, he saw that Emily had packed her things and asked, "Are you going home today?" Emily nodded. "Yes, I'm going to make some food to bring you and stop by the office to sort something out." Mark mumbled an okay without asking more, without trying to stop her. That attitude confirmed Emily's suspicions. He wanted her out of his sight. She smiled to herself but kept her expression serene. Before leaving, she stopped by the old woman's room. She had been moved to another one for more tests. Seeing Emily, the old woman immediately took her hand. "Be careful, dear. And remember my words. Emily bowed her head. "Yes, I remember. Thank you so much, ma'am." The old woman looked at her for a long moment and then said slowly, "Don't blame yourself for having trusted. Trusting your husband is not a mistake. The mistake was him betraying you. Keep your heart clean and let the truth handle the things of life." Emily left the hospital and took a cab home. On the way, she called her mother. Hearing her mother's voice on the other end, a lump formed in her throat. "Mom, I've been so tired these days." Her mother didn't ask many questions, only said, "Come home for a few days, dear." When a woman is tired, she needs a place to lean on. Tears almost escaped Emily's eyes, but she held them back. "Yes, I'll get organized." Arriving at the house, she opened the door and a sense of emptiness washed over her. The house was the same, but she knew it was no longer a safe place. She started checking drawers and closets. All that was left were unimportant papers and old bills. A few faded wedding photos. She picked one up, looked at the two smiling faces, and wondered if Mark had ever imagined this day back then. She put the photo back down. She didn't tear it or take it with her. Some things don't need to be destroyed, just placed in their proper spot in the past. She took out a notebook and started writing. Dates, amounts of money Mark had transferred, the times his attitude had changed, the interventions of her mother-in-law, Susan. As she wrote it down, she felt less confused. They were no longer vague feelings, but pieces of a clear puzzle. At noon, Susan called. Her tone was not exactly friendly. "Are you home yet? Remember to clean up. Make it look like a woman lives there. It's always so messy." Emily took a deep breath and replied, "Yes, Mom, I know." Susan was silent for a few seconds and then continued. "Mark says you've been very irritable lately, and that it's tiring him out. A woman must know how to yield to keep her husband. Don't make a mountain out of a molehill." Emily clenched the phone. Before, she would have apologized. Today, she just said, "Yes, I've heard." She hung up and sat thoughtfully. Her mother-in-law was still the same, always believing her son and considering her daughter-in-law's endurance an obligation. Suddenly, she understood that if everything came to light, Susan would not be on her side. That no longer hurt her, it woke her up. In the afternoon, she stopped by the office to request a few days off. Her boss asked what was wrong. Emily just said she had a family matter. Leaving the building, she felt like she was stepping onto a new path, uncertain but necessary. She returned to the hospital in the evening. Mark was watching TV. Seeing Emily, he was a little surprised. "Why are you back so soon?" Emily set her bag on the floor. "I'm done." Mark looked at the bag curiously. "Did you bring a lot of things?" "Yes, some things I need," she replied curtly. Dinner passed in silence. Mark ate. Emily sat beside him, but there were no more questions or fussing like before. Mark seemed annoyed but said nothing. The silence between them was like a thick pane of glass. They could see each other, but they couldn't touch. Later, Susan returned to the hospital. She brought a bag of fruit, but her gaze was inquisitive. "Daughter-in-law, you've been very strange these days. Are you hiding something from me?" Emily looked up and met Susan's gaze directly. For the first time, she didn't look away. "It's nothing, Mom. I'm just tired," Susan huffed. "Tired or not, you have to take care of your husband. When a woman marries, she must know how to sacrifice." Emily nodded, but thought to herself that sacrifice did not mean closing her eyes. Susan stayed for a while and then left. Mark walked her to the door and whispered something. Emily didn't hear it, nor did she want to. When Mark returned, he looked at her, his tone softer than usual. "Don't worry, my mother. If there's something wrong, we can talk about it calmly." Emily smiled bitterly. "Okay." Mark frowned as if he didn't like her attitude, but he turned away. That night, Emily didn't sleep. She opened her phone and reviewed the photos and notes she had saved. She felt a deep sadness, but there was no longer despair. She thought of her mother, the old woman, the person she herself had been years ago. She wondered what would have happened if she had continued to stay silent. The next morning, she decided to call a lawyer friend. Just for information, without giving names. Listening to him analyze her rights, the joint property, she understood even more that the old woman was right. Without preparation, she would lose everything. After hanging up, her heart felt heavy, but also more resolved. She no longer dreamed of Mark coming back. What she needed now was not an apology, but a dignified exit for herself. She looked at Mark, who was sleeping. The morning light illuminated his face. She whispered to herself, "If you had any affection left, things would not have come to this." She got up and went outside for a deep breath of air. The road ahead was long and painful, but she knew she was no longer walking blind. And from that moment on, she began to prepare for the day she would have to face not only Mark, but his entire family and herself. That morning, the hospital was more crowded than usual. The sound of footsteps, patient names over the PA system, and intercom announcements echoed everywhere. Emily sat by the window, a cold glass of water in her hand that had been there for a while, staring at the small courtyard below without really seeing anything. In her mind, everything seemed to have been sorted into clear compartments. There was no more chaos, only pain, but a lucid pain. Mark woke up later. He looked at Emily and asked something that sounded like concern but was empty. "Didn't you sleep last night?" Emily nodded. "I had a hard time." Mark sighed. "Don't overthink things. Everything will work out." Emily turned to look at him. This time she watched him closely. The lines at the corners of his eyes, his posture slightly leaning toward the wall, the way he avoided her gaze. Suddenly, she saw that this man was no longer her partner, but someone on the defensive. And when someone becomes defensive with their own wife, the marriage is broken at its core. She didn't reply. She got up to buy breakfast. In the hallway, she ran into Mike, a distant cousin of Mark's who worked at the hospital. Mike looked at her with concern. "How's Mark doing, Emily?" Emily answered politely. "He's doing better, Mike." Mike nodded and then said in a low voice, "If anything is wrong, talk it out between you two. Don't worry, Aunt Susan." Emily smiled to hide her feelings. Again, "Don't worry, Aunt Susan." It was always Susan, the family's honor, the feelings of others. She suddenly understood that, in their eyes, she had never been the one who needed protecting. At noon, Susan arrived at the hospital earlier than usual. As soon as she entered, she asked, "Emily, you didn't buy Mark soup today?" Emily replied, "The doctor said this morning he should eat light, Mom." Susan glanced at her, her voice hardening. "You always have an excuse. But remember one thing, if a wife doesn't take good care of her husband, other women will do it for her." That sentence was like a needle driven straight into Emily's heart, but she no longer flinched. She looked at Susan with a strange calm. "Yes, I understand." Susan was a little taken aback by this attitude. Perhaps she wasn't used to an Emily who didn't react, who didn't justify herself. Mark, in bed, looked at them both with an uncomfortable expression. In the afternoon, the doctor told Mark he could be discharged in a few days but would need rest and limited movement. Hearing this, Susan turned to Emily. "So, home soon. Daughter-in-law, get everything ready, clean and cook properly. If Mark comes home to a messy house, I won't be at peace." Emily nodded. "Okay." But in her mind, a clear thought had just emerged. Going home, yes, but to what home? That night, Emily went out to call her mother. Her mother, hearing her voice, knew instantly that something was wrong. "Are you okay, dear?" Emily was silent for a moment and then said, "Mom, if I didn't live with Mark's family anymore, would you be sad?" There was a few seconds of silence on the other end of the line. Then her mother said slowly, "I would only be sad if you were suffering and still enduring it. If you choose to live with dignity, I won't be sad." Tears welled up in Emily's eyes, but this time she didn't sob. They just fell silently, as if releasing a part of her burden. She hung up and returned to the room. Mark was talking on the phone in a low voice. Seeing Emily, he hung up quickly. Emily clearly saw his nervousness. She sat in a chair and said in a soft but firm voice, "Mark, I want to talk to you." Mark was startled. "About what?" Emily took a deep breath. "The house papers, the financial papers, you have it all. I want to know." Mark frowned. "I already told you. I have it for convenience." Emily looked at him directly. "Convenience for whom?" Mark fell silent. That silence was the answer. Emily continued, her voice not loud, but every word was clear. "I'm not asking to argue. I just need you to tell me the truth. Are we still husband and wife? I need to know." Mark turned his face away and sighed. "You think too much. I'm sick. Don't tire me out more. Emily smiled sadly. Your leg is hurt, not your mouth. If you still considered me your wife, you wouldn't hide things from me. Mark turned, his gaze turning cold. So what is it you want? That question hurt Emily, but it also woke her up. She said slowly, I want clarity. If not now, then soon. Mark didn't answer. He turned to the wall, ending the conversation as always, with evasion. That night, Emily packed her things more neatly, not to leave immediately, but to mentally prepare for a calculated exit. She remembered the old woman's words. Don't make a scene, but don't be blind either. The next morning, David stopped by to visit. He looked at Emily, hesitant. Are you okay? Emily smiled slightly. Yes, I'm okay. David sighed. If anything happens, think of yourself first. Don't let them look down on you. Emily nodded. She knew David understood more than he was saying. At noon, the old woman was transferred to rehabilitation. Before leaving, she held Emily's hand tightly. Remember my words. When you need me, call. Emily bowed her head. Yes, I remember. Watching the old woman's figure disappear down the hall, Emily felt a void in her heart, but also more resolve. The old woman had come into her life by chance, but it was enough to wake her from a long dream. That afternoon, Emily called her lawyer friend and made an appointment. She didn't tell him all the details, just asked what she needed to know. Every answer from her friend was like a hammer striking the truth. If she didn't prepare, she would be the one to lose out. When she returned to the room, Mark was asleep. She watched him for a while. She no longer felt love, nor resentment, just a deep, silent sadness. She understood that some marriages don't end with a big fight, but with a prolonged silence until one of them no longer wants to talk. She turned and left. The hallway was long and brightly lit. She walked slowly, but each step was firm. Though the future was full of difficulties, she knew she was no longer the woman who only knew how to wait. The real confrontation had not yet come, but Emily was ready, not to hold on, but to preserve the dignified life she deserved. On the morning of the 7th day, the hospital was quieter than usual. Sunlight streamed through the hallway windows, painting long stripes of light on the cold floor. Emily woke up very early, not from a nurse's call, but because her heart could no longer rest. Life's most important decisions are not usually made in the midst of noise, but in quiet mornings like this. Mark was still asleep, his face turned to the side, his breathing even. Emily watched him for a long time, not to rekindle old feelings, but to wonder how long she had walked beside him, feeling completely alone. Suddenly, she understood that what exhausts a person isn't betrayal, but being taken for granted. Silently, she went out to buy 2 sandwiches and 2 cartons of milk. When she returned, Susan was already in the room, arranging Mark's sheets with a gesture that was both familiar and controlling. Seeing Emily, she said immediately, "Where have you been so early? Your husband is lying here, and you're not by his side." Emily placed the food on the table, her voice calm. "I went to buy breakfast for Mark." Susan huffed. "Buying is fine, but a wife should know when to be by her husband's side. Sick men are very vulnerable." That sentence, in another time, would have hurt Emily, made her feel guilty. Now she just felt tired. She replied, "Okay." Mark woke up and, sensing the tension, said, "Mom, sit down and rest. I'll eat anything." Susan turned to her son, her tone softening completely. "Eat, son. Let me feed you." Emily stepped aside, neither intervening nor retreating. She realized that in this room she was like a guest who had overstayed her welcome. But unlike before, she no longer felt sorry for herself. She just saw things clearly. After breakfast, Susan took Emily into the hallway. She spoke bluntly. "Emily, I'm telling you seriously. With Mark being so sick, don't make a scene. A family is meant to be protected, not to see who wins." Emily looked at her mother-in-law, for the first time not avoiding her gaze. "I also believe a family should be protected. But how do you protect it without losing myself?" Susan frowned. "What do you mean?" Emily spoke quietly, but firmly. "I don't want to argue. I just want to live with clarity. I won't fight for what isn't mine, but I can't pretend I don't see what is." Susan was silent for a few seconds and then said, My dear, a woman is defined by her ability to endure. If you give in a little, the house will be at peace." Emily shook her head, very slightly. "I've been giving in for 5 years, Mom." The sentence, though not loud or harsh, left Susan speechless. She looked at Emily as if for the first time she saw that her daughter-in-law was no longer someone who only knew how to say yes. That afternoon, the doctor allowed Mark to take a few small steps. Emily helped him. Mark held onto her arm, not tightly, but enough for Emily to feel his dependence. He whispered, "Don't confront my mother. She's old," Emily replied. "I know." Mark hesitated. "I'm tired too. Give me time." Emily looked at him directly. "I've given you a lot of time." Mark said no more. He turned his face away, as always. But Emily no longer expected an answer. At night, David called. His voice was serious. "Are you okay?" Emily replied. "Yes, better than I thought." David was silent for a moment and then said, "If you need a temporary place to stay, I can help." Emily knew David was saying it like a brother, nothing more. She thanked him. "Thank you. I'll see how I manage." She hung up and sat by the window, watching the hospital lights turn on. She thought of her mother, of her youth, of her simple dream of having a peaceful family. No one gets married preparing for a separation, but that doesn't mean you have to stay at any cost. The next day, the old woman passed by the room in her wheelchair. Seeing Emily, she gestured for her to come closer. Emily rushed over and took her hand. The old woman smiled kindly. "You've lost weight." Emily smiled. "It must be from being in the hospital." The old woman looked at her, her eyes seeming to see right through her. "No, it's because your heart is heavy." Emily lowered her head. The old woman continued, "You've started walking. Don't stop halfway," Emily asked quietly. "Am I selfish for doing this?" The old woman shook her head. "Protecting yourself is not selfishness. It's simply stopping yourself from getting hurt." That afternoon, Emily met with her lawyer. The conversation wasn't long, but it was enough for her to understand that what she was doing was necessary. When she returned to the hospital, she felt she had crossed to another shore. Not happy, not sad, just firm. Mark saw the folder Emily was carrying and asked, "Where are you coming from?" Emily replied, "From my lawyer's office." Mark froze. "Are you that serious?" Emily looked at him without reproach. "I'm only serious about my own life." Mark was silent for a long time. For the first time, he didn't avoid her gaze, but in his eyes, Emily was no longer searching for anything. Susan found out that night. She called Emily and said in a low voice, "Do you really intend to go all the way?" Emily replied, "Yes, I intend to do what's right." Susan sighed, this time without harshness. "I didn't expect you to be so determined," Emily said slowly. "There are decisions that, if you don't make them now, you regret later." Susan turned away without another word. Emily knew her mother-in-law didn't accept it, but at least she understood that she was no longer an easy person to bend. That night, Emily packed more of her personal things. Mark saw her but didn't stop her. They both knew the rope was so frayed it would break without needing to be pulled. Lying on the cot, staring at the ceiling, Emily's heart no longer wavered, as it had in the first few days. She knew more difficulties awaited her, but at least she was no longer deceiving herself. A marriage was about to end, but another life was beginning. Not loudly or dramatically, but like a path Emily was ready to walk on her own 2 feet. That morning, Emily no longer woke with the heaviness of the past few days, but not with relief either. It was an in-between state, like someone who has just crossed a rope bridge, aware of reaching the other side but with legs still trembling. She sat up and folded the cot's blanket with slow, careful movements, as if a sudden gesture could break everything. Mark was already awake, propped up against the headboard, watching her with an unreadable expression. There was no longer coldness, but not the tenderness of old times either, just a void that floated between them. "Where are you planning to go today?" Mark asked. Emily paused for a moment and replied, "I'm going back to the house to get more of my things." Mark fell silent. A moment later, he said, "Are you planning to move out completely?" Emily turned to look at him. "I'm just taking what's mine." The answer was clear enough. Mark didn't ask any more questions. He turned to look out the window, where the morning sun lit up the white sill. Perhaps for the first time, he realized that Emily was no longer under his control. Susan arrived at the hospital later than usual. Upon entering, she noticed the strange atmosphere. She looked at the suitcase by the chair and then at Emily. "Are you leaving again?" Emily nodded respectfully. "Yes," Susan sighed, her tone less aggressive but still laden with pressure. "Think about it carefully. A woman who abandons her husband's home. People will talk. Can you handle that?" Emily replied slowly. "I can handle that if it means I don't have to handle this situation every day." Susan froze. Mark turned, intending to say something, but held back. Emily didn't argue or analyze who was right. She simply stated her truth, and that made it difficult for others to refute. Before leaving, she stopped by the old woman's room. She was sitting up, running her fingers over a wooden rosary. Seeing Emily, she smiled kindly. "Are you leaving, dear?" Emily nodded. "Yes, I'm going home to do some things." The old woman took her hand. "Go, but remember you are leaving to live, not to run away." Emily bowed her head. "Yes, I remember." On her way home, she took the bus. The city was crowded in the morning, but her mind was strangely calm. She looked at the people around her. Everyone had their own stories, their own worries. She suddenly understood that she wasn't special, that her pain wasn't unique, but what mattered was whether she chose to face it or continue to suffer in silence. Arriving at the house and opening the door, the familiar smell of the kitchen hit her. She had placed so many hopes in that house. She went into the bedroom. The bed, the closet, the dresser. Everything was the same, only she was different. She opened the closet and began sorting clothes, clearly separating what was hers from what would stay. There were dresses she had worn on nights waiting for Mark to come home late, a dress she bought in their first year of marriage and never got to wear. She picked it up and put it back. Not out of sorrow, but because she no longer felt the need to take it with her. While she was sorting, the phone rang. It was her mother. "Are you home yet?" Emily replied. "Yes, I'm packing my things." Her mother was silent for a few seconds and then said, "Come stay at my place for a while." That sentence brought a lump to her throat. "Mom, you don't blame me?" Her mother sighed. "I would only blame you if you didn't dare to live with dignity." Tears streamed down Emily's cheeks, but this time they were tears of gratitude. Sometimes, a single sentence like that is enough for a person to keep going. At noon, she carried the suitcase out the door. Before leaving, she stood in the middle of the living room and looked around one last time. No resentment, no nostalgia. Simply closing a chapter of her life. When she returned to the hospital to pick up the last of her papers, Susan was sitting next to Mark. Seeing Emily with the suitcase, Susan jumped up. "You're really leaving?" Emily nodded. "Yes." Mark spoke quietly. "Where are you planning to go?" Emily replied. "To my mother's house." Susan shook her head. "You're putting pressure on Mark." Emily looked at her directly. "No, I'm just stopping the pressure on myself." The atmosphere in the room grew heavy. Susan wanted to say more but held back. Perhaps she realized that any advice at this point was useless. Emily signed the last papers and went to the old woman's room to say goodbye. The old woman saw the suitcase and smiled slightly. "So you're really going?" Emily took her hand. "Yes, thank you for everything," the old woman said slowly. "Some people only cross your path for a moment, but they are enough to change your life. Remember, don't go back to a place that has hurt you just because you're afraid of being alone." Emily nodded. She would carry those words with her for a long time. As she left the hospital, she didn't look back, not out of anger, but because there was nothing left to tie her there. She knew Mark would be discharged, that Susan would find a way to manage. Their lives would go on, just without her. That evening, she arrived at her mother's house. Her mother opened the door and hugged her tightly, asking no questions, only saying, "You're here now. Get some rest." Lying in her old bed, listening to the steady hum of the fan, the familiar space soothed her. Though she didn't know what the future held, at least that night she would sleep feeling safe. At the hospital, Mark looked at the empty chair beside his bed. For the first time, he felt that the room was bigger, but also colder. He picked up the phone, intending to call Emily, but put it back down. He suddenly understood that some people, once they leave, don't come back with a simple phone call. Susan, sitting beside her son, sighed. She didn't say it, but inside, she was also starting to worry. Not for Emily, but for Mark, for her own family. And Emily, in her small room with her mother, closed her eyes. A chapter of her life had ended. She didn't know how to write the next one, but she was sure of one thing. This time, she would be holding the pen. The first night at her mother's house, Emily slept deeply, without nightmares, without waking up with a start. In the morning, light filtered through the old window, illuminating a wall faded by time. The smell of hot oatmeal from the kitchen reached her, an aroma so familiar it made her lie still for a few seconds. It had been a long time since she had woken up with that feeling. No rush, no suspicion, no need to guess who she might upset that day. Her mother placed a bowl on the table and looked at her. "Eat and rest. There will be time for everything else later." Emily nodded. She picked up the spoon, but a lump formed in her throat before she could take a bite. Her mother saw it but didn't ask, just sat down beside her. A moment later, she said very quietly, "Some marriages don't break because you did something wrong, but because the other person is no longer walking in the same direction." Emily lowered her head. That sentence was like untying a knot that had been tight inside her for a long time. At noon, David stopped by to visit. He brought some fruit, set it on the table, and spoke casually. "I came to see if you were doing okay." Emily smiled. "Yes, I'm okay now." David observed her more closely and said, "Okay, as in, you've made a decision." Emily didn't deny it. "Yes." David sighed. "I'm not going to advise you to go back, but there are some legal matters I think you should sort out soon." Emily nodded. "I'm on it," David continued, his voice steady. "Mark is not an easy person when it comes to his own interests. Be careful." Emily understood. In reality, since she left the hospital, she had no more illusions. Mark's silence wasn't remorse, it was calculation. That afternoon, Emily's phone rang. It was Susan. She stared at the screen for a long time before answering. "Yes, hello." Susan's voice was heavy. "You've really left?" Emily replied. "Yes." Susan was silent for a moment and then said, "Mark is very sad. He doesn't say anything, just stays quiet." Emily felt a slight pang but remained calm. "I hope he gets better soon." Susan lowered her voice. "Could you come visit him? After all, you're husband and wife." Emily closed her eyes and opened them again. "Mom, I need some time." Susan said no more, just sighed. The call ended in a tense silence. Emily put the phone down. Her hand was trembling slightly, but not her heart. That night, Mark called. She saw his name on the screen and, this time, answered more quickly. "You called?" Mark's voice was hoarse. "You're gone. The house is so empty." Emily replied, "I know." Mark was silent for a few seconds. "Come back. We can talk about it." Emily shook her head, though she knew he couldn't see her. "I'm not coming back now." Mark's voice began to rise. "Are you really going to leave me?" Emily replied slowly. "I'm not leaving you. I'm just stopping my endurance." Mark laughed bitterly. "Do you think I'll be scared if you leave?" Emily sighed. "I'm not leaving to scare anyone. I'm leaving so I can continue to be myself." Mark fell silent and then said, "If you don't come back, I'll file." Emily replied calmly, "Do what you think is right." The call ended. Emily sat for a long time, staring at the wall. Her heart no longer ached as it had before. She only felt an emptiness that wasn't as terrifying as being trapped in pain. A few days later, a summons from the court arrived. Mark had filed first. Emily took the paper, her hand steady. Her mother saw her and asked, "Are you okay?" Emily replied, "Yes, I was prepared." She called her lawyer to make an appointment. Everything happened faster than she expected. Once things come to light, there is little room for evasion. Meanwhile, at the hospital, Mark was discharged. Susan took him home. Emily's absence in the house bothered Susan. She would clean and complain at the same time. "Everything is a mess. Without a woman, this house is chaos." Mark, sitting on the sofa, didn't reply. He would pick up his phone, turn it on and off. Inside, a nameless feeling began to grow, a mixture of anger and unease. A few days later, Susan went to Emily's mother's house. She rang the doorbell. Emily's mother opened it and was surprised to see her. "Come in." Susan entered, her tone less aggressive than before. "I've come to talk." Emily came out of her room and bowed her head. "Hello, Mom." Susan looked at Emily, her expression complex. "Do you really want to see this through to the end?" Emily replied. "Yes, I have no other choice." Susan sighed. "Mark made a mistake, but he's a man. If you do this, you'll be the one who loses out." "It is, friend." Emily's mother intervened, her voice calm but firm. "My daughter doesn't lose by protecting herself." Susan turned, a bit taken aback. Emily looked at her mother, feeling a warmth inside. She said, "I don't want to make things difficult for anyone, but I also can't go back as if nothing happened." Susan was silent for a long time and finally said, "If that's the case, I just hope everything is resolved peacefully." Emily nodded. "That is my wish too." End quote. After that visit, Susan didn't call as often. Mark would send messages from time to time, sometimes with reproaches, sometimes with sweetness. Emily didn't reply at length, just maintained the necessary distance. The court date approached. The night before, Emily sat alone on the porch. The night air was cool, the sky moonless. She remembered every stage she had been through, from the early days of her marriage to the moment she began to feel exhausted and finally the decision to leave. No moment had been in vain. The next morning, she dressed in a white shirt and dark pants. Her mother looked at her and adjusted her collar. "It's okay. I'm here." At the courthouse, Mark arrived with Susan. He looked at Emily, his expression no longer as arrogant as before. Perhaps he didn't expect Emily to go this far. The session was tense but orderly. Emily's lawyer presented the facts clearly. Mark lost his temper at times, but Susan held him back. When asked for her opinion, Emily said concisely, "I wish for this to be resolved according to the law. I am not looking to win or lose, only for justice." That sentence silenced the room, not because of its grandiosity, but because of its firmness. The session ended. There was no final conclusion yet, but the path was clear. As they left the courthouse, Mark called out to Emily, "Do you really have nothing more to say to me?" Emily looked at him, for the last time, as his wife. "I said everything the day I left." Mark stood motionless. Susan took her son away. Emily turned to her mother and let out a long sigh. Her mother took her hand. "You did well." On the way home, Emily watched the city pass by through the car window. Everything was the same, only she was different. She was no longer the woman who was afraid of losing, but the woman who knew what she deserved. The battle was not over, but she was no longer in a position of weakness. Because when a person dares to leave, they have already conquered their greatest fear. The days of waiting after the first court session passed more slowly than Emily had imagined, not out of impatience, but because for the first time in years she had too much space to think. In the mornings, she helped her mother cook and sweep the yard. In the afternoons, she would read or walk around the neighborhood. This simple life made her realize that peace is not a luxury, just that she had never given herself permission to live this way before. Her mother watched her daughter change every day. She no longer had that look of exhausted effort, nor that cautious gaze. One evening, while they were having tea, her mother said slowly, "You've changed." Emily smiled. "Yes, I've noticed too," her mother asked. "Do you have any regrets?" Emily thought for a moment and replied, "I'm sad sometimes, but I don't regret it." Her mother nodded. She knew the decision had not been easy, but it was necessary. Meanwhile, Mark was beginning to feel the consequences of the emptiness. The house no longer had the sound of Emily's footsteps in the morning, nor a hot dinner waiting for him when he came home late. Susan tried to fill her place, but the more she did, the more frustrated she became. She wasn't used to taking care of everything. In her moments of fatigue, she would blame her son. "This is all your fault. You had a good wife, and you didn't know how to appreciate her." Mark listened without arguing, but inside, an uncomfortable feeling was growing, not because he missed Emily, but because he missed the comfort he was used to. One afternoon, Mark went to Emily's mother's house. He stood at the door, hesitating for a long time before daring to ring the bell. Emily opened it and was surprised to see him. He was thinner, his face gaunt. "Can I come in and talk for a moment?" Mark asked. Emily looked at him, then at her mother. Her mother said, "Come in. If there's something to say it clearly." Mark sat across from Emily, embarrassed. "I didn't think things would go this far," Emily replied calmly. "I did, and for a long time." Mark lowered his head. "I know I was wrong, but we can start over." Emily looked at the man before her, her heart no longer fluttering. "Do you want to start over because you miss me, or because it's inconvenient to live without me?" Mark fell silent. That silence, once again, was the answer for Emily. Susan, who had been listening from outside, couldn't hold back and came in. "Emily, you should think about the family too. Going to court is an embarrassment for everyone," Emily said quietly. "Mom, I never wanted this to be a scandal, but if I don't see it through, I would despise myself." "In Wednesdays," Susan insisted, but Emily's mother spoke first. "Susan, my daughter has done nothing wrong. She has only chosen to live with dignity." Susan froze, perhaps not used to being spoken to so frankly. Mark stood up, his voice low. "Let's go, Mom." Before leaving, he turned to look at Emily. "If you ever need anything, Emily shook her head. "I don't need anything anymore." The door closed. Emily stood still for a moment and then went back inside. She felt no satisfaction, nor much sadness. Just a final confirmation. A few days later, her lawyer informed her that Mark's side was proposing a settlement. They agreed to divide the assets as stipulated by law, but asked that Emily sign quickly to save face. Hearing this, Emily didn't respond immediately. She needed time to think, not because she was hesitant, but to make sure she didn't overlook anything. She met the old woman one afternoon. She was out of the hospital and staying with some acquaintances nearby. Seeing Emily, she smiled kindly. "You're thinner, but your eyes are brighter." Emily sat beside her and told her everything. The old woman listened and said slowly, "Some people are more afraid of losing their reputation than their morals. Don't accept a bad deal just to end things peacefully." Emily nodded. Her words always hit the mark. That night, she called her lawyer and clearly stated her conditions. She didn't ask for more, but she wouldn't accept injustice either. Everything had to be transparent. On the day of the official settlement meeting, Mark arrived early, accompanied by Susan. Emily entered, looking serene. As she sat across from him, Mark looked at her for a long time, as if searching for an image from the past. But Emily neither looked away nor softened. The lawyer presented the agreement. Mark accepted, but Susan did not. She said bluntly, "A daughter-in-law who goes to such extremes, no one will want to marry her after this." Emily looked at Susan, her voice calm. "Mom, if a marriage requires me to endure in silence to be accepted, I'd rather not have one." The room fell silent. Mark lowered his head, for the first time not defending his mother. Perhaps he understood that everything had gone too far. The settlement ended in an orderly fashion. As she signed, Emily put down the pen. Her hand did not tremble. A chapter of her life closed with a clean signature, without tears. As they left the room, Mark called out to Emily, "I'm sorry." Emily looked at him kindly. "I accept your apology, but an apology is not enough to come back." Mark nodded and left. Susan followed without a word. That night, Emily had dinner with her mother. The meal was simple, but it tasted better than any other. Her mother asked, "Is it all over now?" Emily replied, "Almost." Her mother smiled. "That's good." End quote. That night, Emily sat thinking for a long time, not about Mark, but about her future, her job, her home, her relationships. She knew the road ahead would not be easy, but at least it was a path she had chosen for herself. Elsewhere, Mark sat alone in the old house. Susan had already retired to her room. He looked around. Everything was both familiar and strange. For the first time, he understood the true feeling of loss. Not the loss of a wife, but of a person who, without him knowing it, had been holding his entire life together. And Emily, in her small room, closed her eyes. There was no more fear, no more waiting, just a very clear feeling. From now on, every step she took would be for herself. After the settlement, things didn't end immediately, as one might think. Life doesn't close with a signature. It opens with the many small actions that follow. Emily faced the next few days with a completely different mindset. There was no more tension or waiting, no more asking what if. She began to live each day slowly but consciously. In the morning, she would get up early to help her mother with the cooking. Her mother no longer asked about Mark's family. They understood each other in a comfortable silence. One day, as Emily was washing dishes, her mother said suddenly, "You're thin, yes, but you stand up straighter than before." Emily smiled. "Maybe because I don't bow my head as much anymore." Her mother nodded without another word. She knew her daughter had walked a long road, a road not everyone has the courage to complete. Emily went back to work. On the first day, many looked at her with curiosity. News traveled faster than she thought. Some asked tactfully, others directly. Emily didn't avoid the topic, but she didn't give details either. She only said one thing: "I've decided to start over." A simple but sufficient sentence. Those who understood, understood. And for those who didn't, she felt no need to explain. At noon, David invited her to lunch. They sat at a familiar restaurant. David looked at her for a while and said, "You've changed a lot," Emily replied. "I've just realized that I was living too exhaustedly before," David said slowly. "Not everyone is clear-headed enough to stop in time." Emily looked at her glass of water, her voice serious. "If I hadn't stopped, I would have lost myself." David said no more. He knew there are lessons that only the protagonists truly understand. On the other hand, Mark was also living his post-breakup days in his own way. He had gone back to work, but his spirits were not the same. The job was the same, the colleagues too, but at the end of the day, there was no one waiting for him with dinner, no message asking if he'd be late. Susan, at first, blamed Emily, but gradually her frustration turned to her son. One night, she told him bluntly, "If you were so smart, you would have taken care of your wife. Now you know what it's like to miss something." Mark remained silent. He didn't argue or defend himself. Inside, a void was growing that no one could fill. Not because he missed Emily romantically, but because he realized that one person had been silently holding up his entire life. One day, Mark picked up his phone and reread old messages. They were all short questions from Emily. "Have you eaten yet? Coming home late? Take care." He used to be annoyed by them. Now, reading them, he felt his eyes well up, but he understood that some things, once lost, cannot be fixed. As for Emily, her lawyer informed her that the process was nearly complete, with only a few final papers left. Hearing this, she let out a slight sigh. No joy, no sadness, just the feeling of closing a chapter at the right time. That afternoon, she went to visit the old woman. She was sitting on her porch, cleaning vegetables. Seeing Emily, she smiled. "You've come." Emily sat beside her. "Yes, I came to see you." The old woman observed her for a while and then said, "Is it almost all over?" Emily nodded. "Yes, almost." The old woman sighed faintly. "Then you have overcome the hardest part." Emily smiled sadly. "I thought the hardest part was leaving." The old woman shook her head. "No, the hardest part is what comes next, when you have to keep living without resentment." Emily fell silent. The old woman was right. In recent days, she had realized that forgiveness is not granted to others, but to oneself. It's not about forgetting, but about not letting the past control the present. The old woman placed a hand on hers. "Don't be afraid of being alone. Only those who fear loneliness stay in places that hurt them." Emily nodded. She had heard those words several times, but each time she understood them more deeply. A few days later, Susan called Emily unexpectedly. Her voice was no longer so harsh. "Emily, this weekend I wanted to ask you a favor." Emily was silent for a few seconds and then replied, "Yes, Mom," Susan said slowly. "It's Mark. He's not doing well. I don't know how to talk to him. Could you see him? Talk some sense into him?" Emily felt her heart clench, not out of weakness, but because she realized a truth. Only when everything is broken do people begin to feel lost. She replied gently, "Mom, I am no longer the person who can speak for him." Susan sighed. "I know, but I just hope he doesn't go down the wrong path," Emily said very clearly. "I wish Mark well, but I cannot return to my old role." The call ended. Emily put down the phone, her heart calm. She understood that loving someone doesn't mean enduring suffering again. Over the weekend, Mark sent her a message. "I want to see you to talk one last time." Emily thought for a moment and agreed. They met at an old coffee shop. When they saw each other, Mark looked at her for a long time. Emily noticed he no longer had the same confidence as before. "You look different," Mark said. Emily replied, "Because I no longer live for others." Mark smiled sadly. "I didn't expect you to be so determined." Emily looked at him, her voice serene. "I gave myself too many chances to endure." Mark lowered his head. "I was wrong, but I've also lost a lot." Emily replied, "Losing is inevitable, but you lost because of your own choice." Mark fell silent. He understood that this time Emily was not speaking from anger, but from lucidity, and that left him no escape. The meeting ended quickly. No pleading, no arguments, just a polite farewell. Leaving the coffee shop, Emily felt much lighter, not because she had won, but because she had no more ties. That night, she went back home and sat with her mother to watch television. Her mother asked, "Are you sad?" Emily shook her head. "I just feel like I've done the right thing." Her mother smiled and placed a hand on her shoulder. Outside, the sky was darkening. Emily knew the road ahead was still long, but she was no longer afraid. Because she had learned to stand on her own, without needing anyone to hold her up or give her permission, life after a breakup is not a sad ending, it's a new chapter, and Emily this time was entering the new chapter with her own awakened consciousness. The rainy season began with persistent drizzles. Every morning, Emily would wake to the sound of rain tapping on the roof, a sound not jarring, but enough to make one pause. Emily's life, once all the paperwork was nearly finalized, settled into a new rhythm, not exactly light, but much clearer. She moved into a small rental apartment near her office. It wasn't large, just big enough for a bed, a desk, and a small kitchen. On moving day, her mother came to see the place, arranging each plate and glass. She didn't say much, only advised her to take care living alone and to come home if she needed anything. Emily nodded. She knew this apartment was not a temporary refuge, but the place where she would learn to live again from scratch. The first few days alone, she was still not used to it. At night, the silence was so deep she could hear the clock ticking. Sometimes, eating alone, she would remember the dinners before. Even if they weren't happy, at least she had someone across from her. A sense of emptiness would subtly creep in, but Emily didn't avoid it. She learned to live with it, like learning to accept a healed scar. Her work life stabilized. She requested a transfer to a new department, with more pressure, but which gave her a sense of control. At noon, she ate with a few female colleagues. Some were curious, others empathetic, but Emily didn't let these conversations drag her into the past. For her, the present was more important than gossip. One afternoon, leaving work, she ran into Susan at the office entrance. She was standing there, looking much more tired than before. Seeing Emily, she hesitated a little, and then said, "I want to talk to you." Emily was hesitant but nodded. They sat in a small nearby coffee shop. Susan was silent for a long time and then sighed. "Mark has been doing very badly lately. Problems at work, and he's changed too." Emily listened without surprise. She replied softly, "I see." Susan looked at Emily, her voice no longer sharp. "I used to think that if you endured, the house would be at peace, but now I realize that sometimes enduring too much means losing everything." Emily remained silent. It was the first time Susan had spoken like this. It wasn't an apology, but it was an acknowledgement. Susan continued, "I don't expect you to come back. I just want you to know that sometimes I was wrong too." Emily bowed her head. "Thank you for saying that." The meeting ended quickly. No resentment, no reconciliation, just a necessary turning point for each of them to reflect. Shortly after, Emily received the official notification from the court. All proceedings were finalized. She held the document in her hand, reading every line. Her heart beat slowly but steadily. She was no longer anyone's wife, nor did she have any legal ties. A very strange feeling washed over her, a mix of lightness and sadness, but without pain. That night, she had dinner at her mother's house. Her mother looked at the paper, sighed, and said, "Well, a chapter closed." Emily nodded. "Yes." Her mother served her a piece of fish and said in a low voice, In life, everyone gets lost sometimes. The important thing is to know how to find your way back to yourself. Emily smiled. If she had heard those words before, she would have only half understood them. Now it was different. One weekend, she went to visit the old woman. She was weaker, but her eyes still shone. Seeing Emily, she smiled kindly. "You've come." Emily sat down and took her hand. "Yes, I came to see you," the old woman asked slowly. "Is it all over now?" Emily replied. "Yes, it's over." The old woman nodded. "Then you have managed to protect yourself." A lump formed in Emily's throat. The old woman looked at her for a long time and then said, "Do you remember? The day I gave you that bill, you were very angry." Emily smiled slightly. "Yes, I remember." The old woman smiled kindly. "Some things seem like bad luck, but they are actually a blessing. If it weren't for that day, how long would you have kept enduring?" Emily lowered her head. It was true. If it hadn't been for those confrontations, for those direct words, perhaps she would still be deceiving herself in an empty marriage. On her way home, she walked for a long time. The city lights came on. Traffic was heavy. She blended into the crowd, no longer feeling lost. She realized she didn't need to prove anything to anyone. Waking up each morning without a weight on her heart was enough. Elsewhere, Mark was also living difficult days. He had moved out on his own. His work performance worsened, and the relationships he once maintained through Emily grew cold. Sometimes, sitting alone, he would remember the image of Emily in the kitchen, the way she always had everything ready. Only then did he understand that there are losses that cannot be compensated for with an apology. But Emily was no longer there to see it or console him. Everyone must pay the price for their choices. That night, Emily sat in her small apartment, the window open to the breeze. She made herself a cup of hot tea and began to read. No arguments, no sighs, just herself and a life that was slowly falling back into place. She knew that happiness doesn't come immediately after a breakup, but that it appears little by little, in quiet mornings, in tension-free meals, in the feeling of being herself. Outside, the rain had stopped. Emily smiled slightly. The hardest part of the journey was over. What lay ahead was not paradise, but it was a path bright enough to keep moving forward without looking back. On the last morning of the rainy season, Emily woke up earlier than usual. A pale sun filtered through the curtains, drawing a thin golden line on the floor. The small apartment was as quiet as ever, but Emily felt something different inside. It was no longer an effort to get used to it, nor a struggle to endure, but a serenity that had taken root. She made tea and leaned against the window. The alley below was beginning to fill with the sound of motorcycles and the voices of people heading to work. Life went on, stopping for no one. Suddenly, she realized that for a long time she had lived as if her life had to revolve around someone else. Only now, stopping and looking back, did she understand that no one can live for you, nor is anyone responsible for your happiness but yourself. She got dressed for work. Before leaving, she took one last look around. Not out of nostalgia, but to remember that this was the place where she had learned to live alone, without panic, without pleading, without losing her own worth. At the office, she was assigned a new project. The workload was heavier, the pressure too, but Emily was not afraid. She worked with focus and clarity, not distracted by external matters. A colleague told her, half joking, half serious, "You've changed a lot lately. You seem much stronger." Emily smiled. "Maybe because I'm no longer trying to please everyone." She said it naturally, without bitterness or defiance, simply the truth. At noon, she went to visit her mother. She was in the yard, cleaning vegetables. Seeing Emily, she smiled. "Have you eaten yet?" Emily replied. "Yes, I have. I just came to see you for a bit." They sat together. Her mother observed her for a long time and then said, "You look like you did before you got married." Emily was a little surprised. "How so, Mom?" Her mother smiled kindly. "In your eyes, you used to look life straight on. Later, you got used to lowering your head." Emily's eyes welled up. It turned out her mother had seen everything for a long time, but had said nothing because she knew there are paths children must walk alone to understand. That afternoon, she visited the old woman one last time before she moved back to her hometown with her relatives. She was lying in bed, thinner, but her eyes lit up when she saw Emily. "You've come." Emily sat down and took her hand. "Yes, I heard you're going back to your town soon." The old woman nodded. "Yes, I'm old now. I'm going back to rest." Emily was silent for a moment and then said, "I still remember the first day I saw you. If it weren't for you, I might not have woken up so soon." The old woman smiled, her voice weak but clear. "I only said what your heart already knew, but what you didn't dare to listen to at the time." Emily lowered her head. The old woman continued, "Remember this well. Not everyone who treats you badly is evil. Some people are just lessons. Once the lesson is learned, you must let go." Emily nodded. She would carry those words with her for the rest of her life. Before she left, the old woman squeezed her hand tightly. "Live with dignity, and don't let one mistake make you afraid for the rest of your life." Emily replied in a low voice, "Yes, I promise." Leaving the hospital, she stood at the entrance for a long time. That place had witnessed a great turning point in her life. From a woman who endured to the point of forgetting herself, she had learned to stand tall, even if it meant paying a price. Thinking about it, she no longer felt resentment for anyone. Not for Mark, not for Susan, not even for herself. Everything had served its purpose. Elsewhere, Mark was also packing his things to move. The old house was now too big for him alone. Susan looked at her son and sighed. "Try to live properly and don't make people suffer anymore." Mark nodded without a word. He understood that some advice comes too late, but must still be heard. In his heart, Emily had become a wound that didn't bleed, but ached. A wound that reminded him that not everything familiar can be taken for granted, and that not everyone by your side will stay forever. That night, Emily sat alone in her room and opened an old notebook. She wrote the final lines of a closed chapter. There were days when it seemed she had lost everything, but in reality, those were the days she found herself. When she finished, she closed the notebook and put it in a drawer. She no longer needed to open it again. The phone vibrated. It was a message from Mark, short and concise. "I wish you peace." Emily looked at the message for a long time and then replied, "I wish you to live with honesty too." Just that, no more, no less. Outside, the city lit up. Emily turned off the light and lay down. There were no more sighs, no more confused thoughts, just a very clear feeling. Tomorrow she would wake up, go to work, and continue living, just like anyone else. But with the difference that she would no longer trade her peace for something that didn't deserve it. Life doesn't promise to compensate those who suffer, but it always gives a chance to those who dare to awaken. And Emily, after everything, had understood something as simple as it was painful. Loving is not sacrificing until you are exhausted, but living together with honesty. When that disappears, leaving is not a failure, it is a way of saving yourself. Emily smiled slightly in the darkness. A chapter of her life had closed, without noise, without drama. The future might still consist of ordinary days, but they would be days where she was her own master, and that was enough. If you have followed Emily to these final lines, perhaps somewhere in her story you have found a part of your own. Perhaps it was the times you endured too much, the nights you wondered where you went wrong, or the moments when, faced with the decision to leave, your heart trembled. This story is not a defense of separation, but a reminder of a fundamental truth. To love does not mean to lose oneself. A family is only a peaceful refuge when there is respect, understanding, and fairness within it. When a relationship forces you to be silent to exist, to bow your head, to be accepted, stopping is not selfishness, it is saving yourself. In life, learn to listen to your intuition, to preserve your self-esteem, to prepare to be independent, both mentally and materially, so that whether you stay or leave, you are never in a position of weakness. If this story has moved you, subscribe to the channel, give it a like, and share it to spread more real, human, and insightful stories like this. Perhaps a story heard at the right time will help someone find the courage to live honestly with themselves.